The airport was alive with its usual buzz, announcements echoing across the terminals, suitcases rolling over the polished floors, and passengers rushing to catch their flights. Amid the crowd, a man in an impeccably tailored suit strolled confidently toward his gate. His presence alone turned heads. Everything about him, from his sleek watch to the air of authority he carried, spoke of success. Little did anyone know, he wasn't just wealthy. He was one of the youngest billionaires in the world. As he approached the boarding gate, he smiled politely at the flight attendant checking tickets. She barely glanced at him, her disinterested expression a stark contrast to the warm welcome she gave the other passengers. He handed her his ticket, and she paused, scrutinizing it longer than necessary. "Is this your ticket?" she asked curtly, her tone laced with skepticism. "Yes," he replied, his voice calm and measured. She hesitated for a moment before sighing loudly and letting him through. He walked toward the plane, shrugging off the interaction as just another day of being judged before being understood. But what awaited him on board was something he could never have anticipated. The plane was sleek and modern, its first-class cabin boasting plush seats and an ambience of understated luxury. The man settled into his seat, gazing out the window as the ground crew worked below. A few rows away, the same flight attendant walked briskly down the aisle, greeting other passengers with a bright smile. But when she reached him, her demeanor shifted. "Excuse me," she said sharply, her tone cold and confrontational. "I'm not sure this is your seat." The man raised an eyebrow, calmly pulling out his boarding pass. "It is," he replied, holding it out for her to see. She snatched it from his hand, examining it as if expecting to find something wrong. Her lips pursed in annoyance, and without returning the ticket, she turned to address him in a voice that was loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "I need to confirm this. Wait here." Whispers rippled through the cabin as passengers exchanged curious glances. The man sat silently, his expression unreadable. Moments later, the flight attendant returned, her attitude even frostier. "There's no way this is your seat," she declared, glaring at him. "I'll need you to move." He met her gaze steadily. "I paid for this seat," he said firmly. "I'm not moving." Her face flushed with irritation, and without warning, she raised her hand and slapped him. Gasps erupted around them as the cabin fell into stunned silence. For a moment, no one moved. The man slowly turned back to look at her, his calm exterior betraying no sign of the storm brewing beneath. "Get out of my sight," she hissed, before storming off down the aisle. He didn't move. He didn't yell. He didn't even touch his cheek where her hand had landed. Instead, he pulled out his phone, his fingers moving swiftly across the screen. The tension in the cabin was palpable. No one knew who he was or what he might do next, but the quiet determination in his eyes hinted that this was far from over. A few rows back, a businessman leaned over to whisper to his seatmate. "That guy doesn't look like someone you'd want to mess with," he murmured. The flight attendant, meanwhile, was busy chatting with a colleague near the front of the plane, laughing as if nothing had happened. But she would soon learn just how wrong she had been. 2 minutes later, something shifted. The man's phone buzzed, and he glanced at the screen, a small smile playing on his lips. He made one final call before leaning back in his seat, his composure unshaken. It wasn't long before the captain's voice crackled over the intercom, calling the flight attendant to the front of the plane. Her confident stride faltered slightly as she made her way up the aisle, but she dismissed her unease. Whatever it was, she was sure she could handle it. What she didn't realize was that the man she had just humiliated wasn't just another passenger. He was a billionaire with connections that reached every corner of the world, including the very airline she worked for. And his next move was about to change everything. As the flight attendant disappeared behind the curtain leading to the cockpit, the passengers whispered among themselves, trying to piece together what had just happened. The man remained still in his seat, gazing out of the window. His calm exterior didn't betray a single hint of the chaos he had already set into motion. The plane had been scheduled to take off within minutes, but something was delaying the departure. Ground staff scurried around the aircraft, speaking hurriedly into their radios. It was clear that this was no ordinary delay, but no one could quite put their finger on why. Meanwhile, the flight attendant stood in the cockpit, arms crossed, her earlier confidence giving way to irritation as she faced the captain. "What's the issue now?" she demanded. "We need to get this flight moving." The captain, an older man with decades of experience, looked at her with a mixture of concern and confusion. "We just received a call from the airline's headquarters," he said cautiously. "They're asking for an incident report before we proceed." "An incident report," she repeated, her voice rising slightly. "What incident?" The captain sighed, glancing at his co-pilot, who seemed equally uneasy. "They specifically mentioned a first-class passenger, said there was a confrontation." Her expression hardened. "You can't be serious." "That man," she started, but the captain cut her off. "Listen," he said firmly, "whoever that man is, he's not just another passenger. This came from the highest level. I need you to tell me exactly what happened." She hesitated, her earlier bravado faltering. She hadn't thought twice about her actions. Just another moment of frustration in a job that demanded constant patience. But now, something about the captain's tone made her uneasy. Back in the cabin, the man in the suit remained quiet, scrolling through his phone, as if nothing was out of the ordinary. A few passengers stole glances at him, their curiosity growing with every passing second. One brave traveler leaned over and whispered, "Excuse me, sir, are you okay?" He looked up, his expression softening. "I'm fine," he replied simply. The passenger nodded, unsure how to respond. There was something about his calmness that was both reassuring and unsettling. It was as if he knew exactly how this would all play out, and he wasn't the least bit worried. Moments later, the flight attendant reappeared in the cabin, her demeanor noticeably different. She avoided looking in his direction as she moved quickly down the aisle, her usual confidence replaced by a sense of urgency. She disappeared into the cruise station at the back of the plane, leaving the passengers to wonder what was happening behind the scenes. Outside the aircraft, a black car had pulled up to the tarmac, its tinted windows glinting under the sun. A man in a sharp suit stepped out, his movements purposeful and precise. He spoke briefly with the ground staff, who nodded before escorting him toward the plane. Inside, the man in the suit received a notification on his phone. He glanced at it, a small smile playing on his lips. It was clear he had been expecting this. The whispers among the passengers grew louder as the black-suited figure entered the cabin, his presence commanding immediate attention. He walked directly to the man in first class, leaning down to speak in a low voice. "Everything has been taken care of, sir," he said. The man nodded, his expression unreadable. "Thank you." The suited figure straightened up and turned to address the flight crew. "I need to speak with the captain immediately." The tension in the cabin was palpable as the man made his way to the front of the plane. The flight attendant, who had been standing at the back, froze in place. Her face paled as she watched him disappear behind the curtain. The minutes that followed felt like hours. Passengers exchanged nervous glances, unsure whether they should be concerned or intrigued. The man in the suit, however, seemed entirely at ease, sipping water and scrolling through his phone as if he were in a quiet lounge rather than the center of a brewing storm. When the suited figure finally reappeared, the captain followed close behind, his expression grim. The flight attendant was called forward once again, and this time there was no mistaking the shift in power. She approached slowly, her earlier arrogance completely gone. The captain spoke in a low, firm voice. "We need to resolve this matter immediately. Headquarters has issued a directive." The flight attendant's voice trembled as she tried to defend herself. "I didn't do anything wrong. He didn't belong in that seat. I was just doing my job." The suited figure raised an eyebrow, his calm voice cutting through her excuses. "Your job does not involve physical confrontation with passengers, nor does it involve making baseless assumptions about who belongs where. Her face reddened, but she had no response. Meanwhile, in first class, the man continued to sit quietly, watching the exchange with an air of detachment. He had seen this type of behavior before, the way people were quick to judge, quick to assume. But he also knew that actions had consequences, and he was a firm believer in accountability. The captain finally turned to the suited figure. "What's the directive?" The man in the black suit handed over a document, his tone neutral but firm. "She's to be removed from the flight immediately. This plane does not leave until the matter is resolved." Gasps rippled through the cabin as passengers realized the gravity of the situation. The flight attendant's face went pale. "You can't be serious," she stammered. "I've worked here for years. You can't just." The suited figure's expression didn't waver. "This decision came directly from the top. If you have any objections, you're welcome to take it up with the board of directors." The captain nodded reluctantly, signaling to another crew member. Within moments, the flight attendant was escorted off the plane, her protests fading into the distance. The man in first class finally looked up from his phone, his calm gaze meeting the suited figures. He gave a small nod of approval, and the man in black turned to leave, his job done. The tension in the cabin slowly began to dissipate as the passengers settled back into their seats, though the whispers and exchanged glances didn't stop. No one knew the full story, but one thing was certain. The quiet man in first class was not someone to underestimate. As the plane prepared for takeoff, the captain made an announcement, apologizing for the delay and thanking the passengers for their patience. The man leaned back in his seat, gazing out of the window once more. The journey ahead was still long, but for now, the first act of this story had come to a close. Yet even as the plane lifted into the sky, the passengers couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something far greater. The plane soared smoothly above the clouds, but the atmosphere inside the cabin remained thick with tension. The earlier confrontation had left an imprint on everyone, from the crew to the passengers. Though outwardly calm, many couldn't stop replaying the scene in their minds, their curiosity growing with every passing minute. Who was this man? What had he done to command such swift and decisive action from people so high up? The man in the first-class seat sat silently, his face illuminated by the soft glow of his phone screen. He had an air of focus, as if he was already moving on to other matters, but anyone paying close attention could sense that the wheels in his mind were still turning. Occasionally, he would glance around the cabin, his eyes scanning the faces of the passengers. The crew, the slightest movements. It wasn't paranoia. It was precision, the practiced awareness of someone accustomed to being in control. Not far away, a pair of business travelers murmured in low voices, their curiosity getting the better of them. "Did you see how quickly they acted?" "He didn't even raise his voice," one of them said, glancing over his shoulder. "Exactly," the other replied, nodding. "This isn't just about money. That guy's got serious influence. You don't move a flight crew like that unless you're someone important." A flight attendant, visibly nervous, walked by carrying a tray of drinks. Her hands trembled slightly as she approached the man's seat. "Would you like anything, sir?" she asked, her voice soft and hesitant. He looked up, offering her a polite smile. "Just water. Thank you." She nodded quickly, almost relieved, and set the glass down on his tray table before hurrying away. Despite his calm demeanor, his mere presence seemed to unsettle everyone around him. In the cockpit, the captain was still processing what had happened. The phone call from headquarters had been unusually direct, leaving no room for interpretation. Whoever this man was, he had enough clout to override standard protocol without breaking a sweat. The captain couldn't help but feel a strange mix of curiosity and unease. People like that didn't appear out of nowhere. They had histories, reputations, and power. Back in the cabin, the murmurs among the passengers grew quieter as the in-flight entertainment screens flickered on. Some tried to distract themselves with movies or books, but their eyes kept drifting back to the man in first class. His silence was louder than words, and the questions surrounding him only grew. Halfway through the flight, one of the crew members approached him discreetly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Sir, the captain wanted me to let you know we're preparing for arrival ahead of schedule. If there's anything you need before we land, please don't hesitate to ask." He nodded appreciatively. "Thank you. I'll let you know." As she walked away, he reached into his carry-on bag and pulled out a slim tablet. Unlocking it, he navigated to a secure communication app. His fingers moved swiftly over the screen, typing out a message that was both precise and deliberate. Within moments, the device buzzed with a reply. He read it, his expression unchanged, and then powered off the tablet, sliding it back into his bag. Meanwhile, the whispers in the economy cabin had taken on a different tone. Word of what had happened had spread through the plane, each retelling adding its own layer of embellishment. Some claimed he was a government official, others speculated he was a tech mogul, and a few even suggested he might be part of some covert organization. The mystery only deepened as time went on. But while most of the passengers were content to speculate, one man in the cabin wasn't. He had been sitting quietly near the back, observing everything from the moment the confrontation began. Dressed casually, he appeared unassuming, blending in with the crowd. Yet his sharp, calculating eyes betrayed him. As the flight attendants served dinner, this man subtly reached into his pocket and pulled out a small notebook. He flipped through its pages, revealing cryptic notes and a list of names. One name stood out, circled multiple times, the name of the man in first class. He leaned back in his seat, his mind racing. This flight hadn't been a coincidence. He had boarded it with a purpose, and now, more than ever, he was certain that his target was exactly who he thought he was. The man in first class, oblivious to the watchful eyes fixed on him from the back of the plane, continued to sit calmly. But for the observer, this was the culmination of weeks, months, even, of planning. Whatever his motives were, they ran deeper than anyone on that plane could have imagined. As the hours ticked by, the plane began its descent. The captain's voice came over the intercom, announcing the approach to their destination and thanking the passengers for their cooperation during an eventful flight. The word hung in the air, drawing subtle smiles and raised eyebrows from those who understood its implication. But beneath the surface, tension was building. The man in the back reached for his bag, carefully extracting a small device. His movements were deliberate, calculated, as he checked and rechecked its settings. He knew the timing had to be perfect. Meanwhile, the man in first class received another notification on his phone. His expression darkened slightly as he read the message, and for the first time, a flicker of something akin to concern crossed his face. He glanced around the cabin, his gaze lingering briefly on the back rows. The observer noticed this and quickly averted his eyes, pretending to adjust his headphones. But it was clear that the dynamic had shifted. The hunter and the hunted were now both aware of each other, even if only subtly. As the plane touched down, the tension reached its peak. The man in first class gathered his belongings with practiced ease, his movements unhurried. He stood, allowing the passengers in the rows ahead to disembark first. The observer waited, watching him carefully. This wasn't the moment to act. Not yet. Timing was everything, and the airport would provide the perfect backdrop for the next stage of his plan. The man in first class stepped off the plane, greeted immediately by a staff member holding a tablet with his name displayed on the screen. They exchanged a few quiet words before he was escorted toward a private terminal. But as he disappeared from sight, the observer followed discreetly, blending seamlessly into the crowd of disembarking passengers. The stage was set, and the game was far from over. Both men knew that what lay ahead would decide everything. The terminal was quieter than the main airport, reserved for VIP passengers and those who operated in the shadows of privilege. The man in the tailored suit walked with purpose, his polished shoes clicking against the pristine marble floor. Beside him, the staff member escorted him through a side hallway, bypassing the usual security checks. Everything about the process was designed to ensure efficiency and discretion, the hallmarks of his lifestyle. But just as he reached the private lounge, his phone buzzed again. He paused, pulling it out to glance at the screen. His brow furrowed slightly. The message was brief, but it carried weight. Unexpected company. Proceed carefully. He slipped the phone back into his pocket, his demeanor unchanged, though his mind was already working through the possibilities. The observer, who had followed him off the plane, kept his distance, blending into the crowd of travelers exiting through the regular terminal. He knew better than to move too soon. Instead, he kept a careful watch, noting the direction the man had taken and the access point he used. The observer wasn't just any bystander. He had a plan of his own, one that required patience and precision. Inside the lounge, the man in the suit was greeted by a second figure, a sharply dressed woman with an air of authority. She approached him quickly, her expression serious. "We've had a development," she said quietly, handing him a slim folder. He opened it, his eyes scanning the contents. Whatever he read caused a flicker of irritation to cross his face, though he masked it almost instantly. "This wasn't part of the agreement," he said, his voice low but firm. "I know," the woman replied, glancing around to ensure no one was listening. "But there's no avoiding it now. He's here." The man closed the folder and handed it back to her. "Then we'll deal with it." His tone carried an edge, a quiet confidence that suggested he had faced worse situations before. The observer, meanwhile, had positioned himself near a row of large glass windows overlooking the tarmac. He appeared to be studying a flight schedule on his phone, but in reality, his focus was on the lounge's entrance. He knew the man wouldn't stay there long. People like him didn't linger. They moved quickly, efficiently, always staying ahead of the game. Moments later, his hunch proved correct. The man emerged from the lounge, accompanied by the woman. They spoke in hushed tones as they walked toward a waiting car outside. The observer slipped into the flow of travelers heading toward the exits, maintaining a careful distance. As the car pulled away, the observer flagged down a cab. "Follow that black sit-in," he instructed, his voice calm but firm. The driver glanced at him in the rearview mirror, clearly uncertain. "This isn't a movie, buddy," he said with a chuckle. The observer leaned forward, slipping a crisp bill into the man's hand. "Just follow it." The cab merged into traffic, trailing the sedan at a safe distance. The observer watched intently as the sedan weaved through the city streets, finally pulling into a secluded parking garage beneath a high-rise building. He instructed the cab driver to stop a block away, paid him generously, and stepped out into the cool evening air. The garage was dimly lit, its shadows deep and concealing. The observer moved quietly, keeping to the edges as he watched the man and the woman step out of the car. They entered an elevator, disappearing behind its mirrored doors. Once they were gone, the observer slipped inside, his movements quick and efficient. He scanned the garage, noting the security cameras and the positions of the cars. He approached the elevator, pressing the call button and stepping inside when the doors opened. The elevator's control panel required a key card for access to the upper floors, but the observer was prepared. He pulled a small device from his pocket, attaching it to the panel. The device blinked green after a moment, and he pressed the button for the highest floor. When the elevator doors opened, the observer found himself in an opulent hallway, its floors covered in plush carpeting and its walls adorned with expensive artwork. He moved carefully, his footsteps silent as he approached the source of muffled voices. At the end of the hallway, he found a large conference room. The man in the suit and the woman were inside, along with two other individuals, one older, with a sharp, calculating gaze, and the other younger, nervously shifting in his chair. The observer couldn't hear everything, but snippets of the conversation reached him through the slightly ajar door. "This changes everything," the older man was saying, his voice cold and authoritative. "If he knows, we're compromised." "He doesn't know," the man in the suit replied. "Not yet. but we need to act quickly before he puts the pieces together." The younger man spoke up, his voice shaky. "And if he already has? What if he's one step ahead of us?" The room fell silent for a moment, the tension palpable. Finally, the woman spoke. "Then we do what's necessary to protect the operation, no matter the cost." The observer leaned back, his mind racing. This wasn't what he had expected. Whatever was happening here was bigger than he had anticipated, and the stakes were higher than he'd imagined. He reached for his phone, typing out a quick message. "They're planning something. Need backup." But before he could send it, a hand clamped down on his shoulder. He spun around, his heart racing, only to come face to face with a security guard. "You're not supposed to be here," the guard said, his expression stern. The observer's mind worked quickly. "I got lost," he said, forcing the sheepish smile. "I was looking for the restroom." The guard didn't buy it. "Let's go," he said, motioning for the observer to follow him. As the guard led him back toward the elevator, the observer couldn't help but glance over his shoulder. The door to the conference room was still ajar, the voices inside growing fainter as he was escorted away. But even as he stepped into the elevator, he knew this wasn't over. Whatever was happening in that room was part of something much larger, and he was determined to uncover the truth, no matter the risks. The elevator hummed softly as it descended, the observer standing rigid beside the security guard. His mind raced, analyzing the situation and calculating his next move. He couldn't afford to walk away now, not when he was so close to the truth. The conversation he overheard had confirmed his suspicions. This wasn't just about one powerful man. It was a web of hidden agendas, each thread more dangerous than the last. The elevator came to a stop, and the guard gestured for him to step out. "Don't come back here," the guard said firmly, his tone leaving no room for argument. The observer nodded, feigning compliance, and walked toward the exit. But as soon as the guard turned his back, the observer slipped into a shadowed alcove near the stairwell. He wasn't leaving. Not yet. From his hiding spot, he could see the garage entrance, where the man in the suit and the woman would likely reappear. He waited, his heart pounding as seconds stretched into minutes. Finally, the elevator doors opened again, and the pair emerged, their conversation hushed but intense. "They'll need confirmation by midnight," the woman said, her voice sharp. "They'll get it," the man replied, glancing around the garage as if sensing they were being watched. His eyes lingered near the stairwell for a moment before he turned back to the woman. "This has to be clean. No loose ends." The observer's pulse quickened. He knew he couldn't let them leave without taking action. As they approached their car, he stepped out of the shadows. "Going somewhere?" he asked, his voice steady despite the tension crackling in the air. The pair froze, their surprise quickly giving way to measured calm. The man in the suit tilted his head slightly, studying the observer. "You've been following us," he said, his tone more curious than accusatory. "Call it professional interest," the observer replied, his posture firm. "You're planning something big, and I think it's time we had a conversation about it." The woman stepped forward, her expression cold. "You don't know what you're getting into," she warned. "Walk away while you still can." The observer shook his head. "Not an option. Whatever you're involved in, it's not staying in the dark anymore." For a moment, the tension hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Then, with a quick glance at the woman, the man in the suit raised a hand, signaling her to stand down. "You've gone through a lot of trouble to get here," he said, his voice calm but laced with authority. "Why don't you tell me what you think you know?" The observer hesitated, weighing his words carefully. "I know you're not just some businessman. I know your connections go far beyond corporate boardrooms. And I know that whatever deal you're making tonight, it's bigger than either of you." The man smiled faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. "You're observant, I'll give you that, but you've only scratched the surface." Before the observer could respond, the sound of tires screeching echoed through the garage. The black SUV sped in, its windows tinted and its headlights glaring. It came to an abrupt stop a few feet away, and 4 men in tactical gear stepped out, their movements swift and purposeful. The woman turned to the man in the suit, her voice low and urgent. "We don't have time for this." But the man held up a hand, signaling her to wait. He turned back to the observer, his expression unreadable. "You've put yourself in a dangerous position," he said, "but perhaps you can still be useful." The observer tensed as the men from the SUV approached, their weapons concealed but their presence undeniably threatening. "What's this?" he asked, his voice steady despite the knot of anxiety tightening in his chest. "A demonstration," the man replied. He gestured to the SUV, where one of the men opened the back door to reveal a briefcase. "Inside this case is information that could change everything you think you know. It's what this entire operation hinges on." The observer narrowed his eyes. "And you're just going to hand it over?" The man smiled again, this time with a hint of amusement. "Not exactly. But I'll give you a choice. You can walk away now. Forget you ever saw any of this. Or you can take a closer look and accept the consequences." The observer hesitated, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He knew he couldn't walk away, not after coming this far. But he also knew that whatever was in that briefcase would pull him deeper into a world he might not escape. "I'll take my chances," he said finally. The man nodded, motioning for one of the guards to bring the briefcase forward. As the observer reached for it, the woman's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, her expression darkening. "We've got a problem," she said, showing the man the message. His eyes flickered with irritation. "How close?" "Minutes," she replied. The man turned back to the observer, his calm facade finally cracking. "It seems we're out of time," he said. "You'll have to figure out the rest on your own." Before the observer could react, the man signaled to his team. The guards moved swiftly, retreating to the SUV and revving the engine. The man and the woman climbed into their car, and within moments, both vehicles sped out of the garage, leaving the observer alone with the briefcase. He stared at it for a moment, his mind racing. Whatever was inside, it was now his responsibility. He picked it up, the weight of it heavier than he expected, and made his way out of the garage. But as he stepped into the night, a sudden realization hit him. The entire encounter had been too controlled, too orchestrated. He glanced down at the briefcase, a sense of unease settling over him. What if this was exactly what they wanted? What if he had just become a pawn in their game? As he opened the briefcase, his heart stopped. Inside was a single document, its contents shocking and incomprehensible. But it wasn't the information that sent chills down his spine. It was the small blinking device tucked beneath it. He barely had time to react before the world around him erupted into chaos. The explosion shattered the silence, a wave of heat and sound rippling through the night. The observer was thrown backward, landing hard on the pavement as debris rained around him. For a moment, everything was a blur, his ears ringing, his vision spinning. He struggled to push himself up, the briefcase now a charred shell lying a few feet away. Whatever had been inside was gone. Pain seared through his arm as he stood, but the adrenaline pumping through his veins dulled it enough for him to focus. He scanned the area, trying to piece together what had just happened. The realization hit him like a second blow. He had been set up. The briefcase was never meant to be opened. It was a diversion, a trap meant to erase any trace of the events in the garage. The sound of distant sirens snapped him back to reality. He needed to leave before more questions arose, questions he didn't have the answers to. Clutching his injured arm, he slipped into the shadows, disappearing into the maze of alleys that surrounded the area. Every step felt heavier, the weight of the night's events pressing down on him. By the time he reached the small, dimly lit motel on the outskirts of the city, exhaustion had taken hold. He locked the door behind him, leaning against it as he tried to catch his breath. His phone buzzed on the bed where he had left it earlier, the screen lighting up with a message. "You're alive. Good. Check the file I sent." Clocks ticking. He frowned, grabbing the device and opening the attachment. It was a document, a detailed report of the operation he had stumbled into. Names, dates, transactions, it was all there, laid out like a puzzle waiting to be solved. And at the center of it was the man in the suit. He wasn't just a player. He was the architect, orchestrating deals and alliances that stretched far beyond what the observer had imagined. But something else caught his eye. A single name buried in the report, highlighted in bold. It was someone he knew, someone he trusted. His chest tightened as he scrolled through the details. The betrayal was sharper than the pain in his arm. This person had been feeding information to the man in the suit, tipping him off and ensuring he stayed one step ahead. The observer sat back, his mind reeling. It wasn't just about exposing the operation anymore. It was personal. He couldn't walk away, not when the betrayal cut this deep. He needed to confront the truth, no matter the cost. The next morning, he made his way to a quiet coffee shop where the person in question often worked. He sat in a corner, watching as they entered, their demeanor as casual as ever. They had no idea he knew. He waited until they sat down before approaching, sliding into the seat across from them. They looked up, startled, but quickly masked it with a nervous smile. "Hey, what are you doing here?" "I think you know," he said evenly, placing his phone on the table and pulling up the document. He turned the screen toward them. "Care to explain this?" Their face paled as they read the screen, their hands trembling slightly. I can explain," they stammered, but the observer cut them off. "Save it," he said sharply. "I trusted you. I thought you had my back. And now I find out you've been working with him." "It's not what you think," they said, their voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't have a choice. He threatened my family. If I didn't cooperate, he said They broke off, unable to finish the sentence. The observer's anger faltered, replaced by a flicker of understanding. He leaned back, running a hand through his hair. "Why didn't you tell me? We could have figured something out together." "I didn't know who to trust," they admitted. "He's powerful, connected. It felt like there was no way out." The observer sighed, his frustration giving way to resolve. "There's always a way out," he said. "But we have to be smart about this. If we're going to take him down, we need to act fast." Together, they began to piece together a plan. The document was their key, but it wasn't enough on its own. They needed to expose it to the right people, those with the resources and authority to dismantle the operation. The observer made a call to a trusted contact, someone who had been fighting corruption for years. After a tense conversation, they agreed to meet. That night, in a secluded office far from prying eyes, the observer laid everything on the table. His contact listened carefully, their expression growing more serious with every detail. When he finished, they nodded. "This is big," they said, "but it's also dangerous. If we move forward, there's no going back." "I understand," the observer replied. "I'm ready." Over the next few days, the operation unraveled. The document was leaked to major news outlets, sparking a media frenzy. The man in the suit and his associates tried to contain the fallout, but it was too late. Investigations were launched, assets were frozen, and one by one, their allies turned on them to save themselves. The observer watched it all unfold from a distance, a sense of relief washing over him. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time in weeks, he felt like he could breathe. His contact assured him that steps were being taken to protect him and his accomplice, though he knew they would have to remain vigilant. As the dust began to settle, he met with his former ally, the one who had betrayed him, but ultimately helped bring the operation down. They stood on a quiet hill overlooking the city, the sun setting in shades of orange and pink. "I'm sorry," they said quietly, "for everything." He nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "What matters is that we stopped him, and that we keep fighting." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of everything they'd endured hanging between them. Then, with a faint smile, The observer turned to them. "You're buying the next round of coffee." They laughed, a sound that felt lighter than it had in weeks. Together, they walked back toward the city, ready to face whatever came next.